since when is a UN resolution, a Security Council UN resolution, not non-binding? Because that's a significant shift. That's not the understanding of most countries, and it's not the understanding of the UN either. This is not a Chapter 7 resolution, so I don't get how the US is now saying that it would be non-binding and basically giving the message that another country wouldn't necessarily need to comply with it.
So let me explain what we meant by that. First of all, as we said yesterday, and we made clear all along, we have always believed that the path to a ceasefire and the release of hostages is something that will be reached through negotiations between Israel and Hamas, enabled by third-party countries, and in which the United States is participating, and not through a UN process, and that remains our belief. When we say the resolution is non-binding, what we mean is that it does not impose any new obligations on the parties, the way, for example, some UN resolutions that impose obligatory sanctions, impose actual requirements on people to implement them. That said, we do believe that even though there are this resolution lacks non-binding provisions and lacks new requirements that it is imposed on the parties, it does carry weight, and it is something that should be implemented.
I mean, that's a little bit contradictory, if I may. I mean, either it's binding or it's non-binding. If it's non-binding, like you said, because it lacks provisions, why would anybody comply with it?
It's non-binding in that it does not impose any new obligations on the parties, but we do believe it should be respected, that it carries weight, and that it should be implemented, as has always been the case, has always been our belief when it comes to UN Security Council resolutions.
If this was non-binding, now the other resolution, the 3 resolutions that you vetoed, were they also in the same kind of resolution?
So, Saeed, I'd have to go back and look at the provisions of those, but we vetoed them. So ultimately, they weren't the voice of the UN Security Council.
I'm saying if they are not binding, then why bother and veto it?
Because they carry weight and should be implemented, and so we want to see resolutions that pass ultimately reflect the policy positions of the United States, which is what I said yesterday. We came to the determination that this Security Council resolution, although it did contain, or it lacked some provisions that we wanted to see, most notably condemning Hamas's actions on October 7th, that it called for 2 things that we support, a ceasefire and the release of hostages together. And so that's why we abstained from the resolution. We do believe that it carries weight and should be implemented.
But and I remember like during the whole Iraq thing, there were 12 UN resolutions, and they were all binding. They were all binding every time, and the U.S. would be the first one to say it's binding. I mean, I worked in Iraq. I know exactly what was going on. So I'm saying that any UN resolution that passes, that is allowed to pass, is potentially can be utilized within the framework of Chapter 7.
Is there a question there, Saeed?
Yes, it is. I'm asking you. I mean, can you answer?
No, it's just there was a statement. I want to see if there's actually a question.
So, okay, let me reframe my question. Do you think
maybe
that this
ask one.
resolution can potentially be subject to Chapter 7?
We believe that the UN Security Council resolution carries weight and should be respected, as I said.
There are some reports that Israelis feel that their ability to depend on the United States has now decreased because of the abstention at the Security Council vote yesterday.
So absolutely not. First of all, the relationship between the United States and Israel is one that is longstanding. They are a longstanding ally of the United States, and the president has made clear that the United States will always support Israel's right to defend itself. That was true before our action in the Security Council yesterday. It remains true today. As I said yesterday, the position that we take, and the position that was contained in that resolution that led us to not block its moving forward, is that there should be a ceasefire and there should be the release of hostages. That is our position. We have believed it has been Israel's position because Israel has been negotiating to try to achieve a ceasefire that would secure the release of hostages. So far from there being, at least in our eyes, any distance between the United States and Israel, we believe the position that we were endorsing at the United Nations yesterday is the same one that Israel has been trying to achieve through the ongoing negotiations. Now, none of that is to say there are not things with which we disagree with Israel. There obviously are. There have been a number of things in recent months.
Netanyahu's office is indicating that the U.S. not vetoing the resolution actually hampered or harmed the hostage talks. Is that the U.S. understanding?
That statement, which I believe said that Hamas pulled out of the hostage talks, or Hamas rejected the most recent proposal because of the United Nations Security Council resolution, that statement is inaccurate in almost every respect, and it is unfair to the hostages and their families. For the United States, we are not going to engage in rhetorical distractions on this issue. We are going to continue to work to try to bring the hostages home.
I understand that U.S. officials say that there are domestic political concerns for Prime Minister Netanyahu when he went forward with, canceling these Rafah meetings here in the United States. But it does have a damaging effect on the U.S.-Israel relationship as well. Are there going to be ramifications for Israel?
When you think about ramifications, we wanted to have that meeting with Israel to present to them an alternative way to accomplish their legitimate security goals of defeating the Hamas battalions in Rafah. We believe it is in their interest to do this in a better way. We believe that a full-scale military operation in Rafah will not just cause civilian harm to the Palestinian people. We believe that that kind of operation would hurt Israel's national security. It will leave Israel more isolated in the world. It will separate Israel from countries that have been longtime partners of Israel. And you've heard this from countries all around the world. So we have been making clear that this kind of operation is not in Israel's interest, let alone in the interest of the Palestinian people. So when you speak to ramifications, those are the type of ramifications that we're worried about for Israel, and that's why we wanted to have this meeting to present to them what we think is a better alternative.
Just to clarify, what does it mean to say that it should be the resolution should be implemented? From the Israeli point of view, I guess they would say there's no deal to be taken at the moment. So. How can they implement?
It goes back to the first point I made, which is that we believe a ceasefire and the release of hostages will be ultimately secured through negotiations. And it's the negotiations that we have been pursuing in the region, most recently over the weekend in Doha. And so we are going to continue to pursue those negotiations to reach a ceasefire and secure the release of all hostages.
Wondering on Rafah, I mean, you've been very clear from the very beginning that you don't dictate policy or operations to Israel. You've said that numerous times. You said you're not involved in the military planning. Here, you're telling them not to do a major offensive in Rafah, but you're giving them or want to talk to them about alternatives, whatever they may be, counterterrorism, what have you, I don't know specifically. But by doing that, you would get directly involved in the operations that were to take place in Rafah, and potentially there could be more civilian deaths and what have you. So in that case, you would be directly involved. How big of a problem is that?
So I don't agree with that. Let me say a few things. Number one, when it comes to dictating, you're right. No, we do not dictate to them. We can't dictate to them. They're a sovereign country, and the United States can't dictate to any sovereign country. They're going to make their own decisions. That said, we always offer our best advice to them. We have done that from the beginning. You've heard the president talk about that when he went to Israel just a week after, or a little over a week after October 7th, where he talked about the fact that because Israel is such a longtime friend, we are going to offer advice about them. So we try.
Very good advice.
And so we try. We try to give them that advice in terms of the options that we will present to them, or that I assume we will present to them at some point. I wouldn't think of it as military planning. We're going to offer them, and I also don't want to preview too much in detail publicly, because these are still conversations that ought to happen privately. But the intent would be to give them advice about how to conduct such operations. It's not to do actual military planning. We're not involved in military planning. That's what I mean. We're not in with them planning exact military operations. But we have always offered them advice about what we have believed the best way to go about this operation is. That's true going back to some of the first meetings that we had in Israel right after October 7th.
Well, then either one of two things. Either you gave very bad advice because you have 30,000 civilians who got killed, or they didn't listen to your advice. So what about Rafah? You think they would? Are they actually listening to what you're saying? Because they said, if we don't have the U.S. on board, we're going it alone.
So they will speak for themselves, but we have not yet had the meeting where we outline the steps that we believe that they ought to take.